So here we have it. This is the video I was going to record yesterday before I got completely sidetracked on the whole engine analysis thing that Yosha did. Now, thanks very much for all the comments. I genuinely appreciated reading through all of those. I am keeping an open mind here, and someone summed it up really well in one of the comments. They said, look, at the end of the day, we need to see the hood opened here on the chess-based analysis so that we can see how this analysis is done exactly with the detail. That would really help me, and I'm sure others who don't fully understand all of this stuff and want to understand exactly what we mean by accuracy and correlation and how we get to these 100% figures and whether or not this has been done fairly for all the players. So I really want to understand that data set a bit more. Now, I haven't heard back from Yosha. I did hit her up on Twitter, had some responses from others, but not her yet, hoping she gets back. But in this game, in this video here, I want to actually look at the game played and just analyse this beautiful game played by Hans Niemann against Christopher Yoo. So Hans had black here, this is 2020, they're both going for a Grandmaster norm, and after e4, he goes e5 in response. Let me just turn this engine off here, sorry, don't lag it out. So knight f3 played, knight c6, now bishop b5, the Roy Lopez attack, and now knight to f6 starts the Berlin defense. So d4 was now played by Christopher. Castles is way more common there, and that can take us into the Berlin endgame stuff with the queens off the board. We see a lot of d3 as well, if you want to go back into some kind of classic slow play Roy Lopez structures. But here we had d4, and now black could take on e4. It's one option here. Hans instead takes this one, and now white just castles the king. Now, if you go e5, it's an important theme to be aware of here. The knight finds a home on e4. This is the key. You don't want to be jumping to d5 here, not a good game. And if the queen harasses it some more, then it comes to c5, and it can also look to cover this square, and black's doing okay. So that's the key thing if that pawn kicks on. So castles was played, now a6, kicks that bishop back. You don't want to be capturing, then this pawn recaptures, and in one move, you've opened up the black queen and the black bishop, and you've given up a good piece for yourself. So instead, this bishop retreats here, and now here Hans goes wrong, perhaps mixes up his opening preparation, so he should go bishop to e7, best move. But he plays pawn d6 instead. Now the reason this isn't as strong is because now you weaken this light square diagonal here, and you could actually start with knight takes on d4, quite a strong move. You keep a few more options open. Sometimes this knight hits f5, the queen can come to f3. You just delay this one. What Christopher does instead is smash up the pawns on c6 here. Pawn recaptures, still a good move, not quite as accurate, but it's still advantage to white, especially because this black squared bishop is looking pretty miserable, stuck in here, looking at its own pawn. This is a cramping pawn you can't take, or rook e1 comes using the pin, picking up a piece. So as long as you can stop black from going d5, white's going to have some good advantage here. So bishop to d7 was now played, covers this knight hopping in. Now we had queen to f3 developing. So a nice multi-purpose move. You put pressure here. Bishop g5 could be coming, and you also eye down in this direction here, d5, c6, etc. So c5 now played by Hans. Very provocative move. Not yet developing pieces, but it does kick that powerful knight. It hops into f5 here, and now it's a tough position for black to play. We'll see in a moment that Hans goes for bishop c6, pinning this pawn, stopping e5. He also then prepares queen d7 and castles queenside. But if he does bishop c6 immediately, well, then you're running into bishop g5. Very uncomfortable. If you go queen d7, this is an ugly pawn structure. If you, instead of doing that, try bishop to e7, breaking the pin, well, you drop this pawn here with check. Obviously terrible. So these are some of the challenges, and this is why bishop c6 wasn't played immediately here, but Hans starts with pawn h6. By the way, this is the position I was looking at in depth yesterday, and the computers are screaming for bishop takes on f5 there, but from a human perspective this looks really scary. To open up the e-file towards your king when you're not yet castled, the line goes like this and you do get castled, but after c4 white's still got a big grip on the centre, hard to get d5 in, etc. So we didn't have bishop takes on f5, h6 played, stops the bishop g5 stuff. Now we had this rook coming to the e-file, preparing e5. Now bishop c6 stops that pawn push just in time, and here Christopher plays a slightly inaccurate move. So he correctly moves the queen, but he brings it to c3, where it blocks the development of the knight, and also it would be better on d3, because then it x-rays his own knight, protects it, and therefore renews that threat of pawn to e5. After it comes to c3 here, we'll see the problem, queen d7, and now you don't have time to go e5, which looks just devastating, right? Because then the queen takes here. Now this whole line is just really beautiful, because even after you win that piece, the pawn then takes with check, king d7, pawn takes on g7. This looks absolutely devastating, right? Bishop recaptures, and you can even win a piece. But the problem is the rook comes to the g-file. Queen moves and you're slamming through here. This is actually leading to checkmate. If you come this way, well, this is mate. If you come this way, we've got the classic windmill stuff. You're soon going to be mated. So these are all the themes going on if you push e5 there. Looks like you should be killing it, but actually you're not. It's not working for white. So f3 was played instead. It protects this square a bit more, also blunts this bishop's influence, renews this threat potentially, although this knight's still a problem. But now castle's queenside came from Hans, and here Christopher goes for a tactic. So he didn't have to play this way. Technically his best is bishop to e3, for one of the key reasons that it stops black from going pawn to d5 and liberating the position. If you do that one here, then the bishop can take on c5. White has a good game, even though black can start taking here and it gets a bit tactical and complicated. White should come out a bit better. But Christopher instead goes for a very, attractive looking idea. He takes with the bishop on h6, with the idea being that if you recapture, well, you drop this knight on f6 when the pawn leaves the defense. So Hans doesn't recapture that bishop. Instead, he plays a brilliant liberating pawn move here, the one I've talked about, pawn to d5. But this is really deep stuff, because to keep an advantage, you basically have to sack a piece, as we'll see in a moment. So pawn d5 on the board. Now Christopher takes on g7 with his bishop, completely the most natural looking move. But just to show you what alternatives he had, now if you take here, not a good move, because after the knight recaptures, you're now hitting queen, also this knight, also the bishop's attacked, 3 pieces on prise, you're going to lose one of them. It's not good. And I mentioned taking here, we see this black pawn go on an absolute munching spree in a moment. So that's why you have to consider this one. What if you don't take there? What if you go, say, rook to d1? That's the top engine move. Well, now d4 comes. Suddenly you've shut out the queen's influence, etc. It's better for black. So this is why Christopher now, after this move of d5, he takes on g7, very logical. Now you really do have a problem with 2 pieces. So Hans takes back, knight recaptures, this knight is attacked, surely it will move right. Well, this is where Hans comes up with his brilliancy. So if you go knight to h5 here, this is one way to bail out. You get the knights off, rook recaptures, but you're 2 pawns down here in this end game, well, not end game, middle game, and this should be a lot better for white really. The computer only gives a small advantage because you do have attacking ideas against the king, but it's better for white. So knight h5, you could bail out to a worse middle/end game with it. But instead Hans plays the absolute best move, the beautiful pawn takes on e4. You give an entire knight, Christopher takes it, then you take a second pawn. And this position is just fascinating because the material is completely level, with the exception that black is a whole minor piece down, but they're completely paralysed. So we'll see this knight move in a moment, but I want to show you some different options that white had. So if you try knight c3, let's say, just developing a piece, Well, the problem with this one is you now bring the queen to d2. As soon as that knight leaves the protection of that square, the queen comes in and you're actually getting mated. There's nothing white can do. There's no rook to e2 because that's covered. There's no queen f3. Of course, the bishop covers that square. You can't go queen g5 to stop the mate, or we just take the queen. And equally, you can't take the pawn, or then we take here with check. You know, that's really bad as well. So that's devastating, the queen's d2 threat. You can't develop the b1 knight. What if instead you just simply take the pawn? Well, now you're ripping open this g-file towards the king. So you could slide the rook across. This is a problem here. There are actually different ways to get advantage in that line, but it's not good opening the g-file to your king. And what if you go queen to f5? Actually trading queens. That's the other fascinating thing here. White can force the queens off the board and is still worse because you have this move, rook d to g8. Now, if white takes, king recaptures, knight moves away, and now you crash through. And again, this is just leading to checkmate because we check from this new diagonal, slicing across. This is just mate. Completely hopeless for white. This is how it could finish, for example. So running it way back here, chopping those queens off immediately, no good. And this is the final line to show you, well, what if instead you check on the back rank like this? This is the top engine line. Well, then we take, that one's forced. Queens come off once again. Again, king recaptures to keep the bishop looking down here. Knight takes, rook takes, and this one's the best for white. You're not so much worse, but you are still worse. A good kind of pawn and a half ahead for black. So many different lines going on. Christopher Yoo goes for this one, however, knight to f5, so that after rook d to g8, he can block the g-file like this. And now Hans plays another brilliant move here. Now, again, this has been pointed at as being potentially suspicious, although I do think there's a ton of logic to this. So he goes king to b7, and he simply protects this bishop now from the queen's attack. And so he's freed up his own queen to activate into the game, for example, to g4. So a4 was now played by Christopher. Again, he's just completely paralysed. Taking the pawn, no good. Trying to develop the knight, no good. You leave d2 for the queen. Queen f4 would seem to be technically best. Just covering this d2 square from the black queen. Preparing to develop the knight, but still black keeps big advantage. But we'll stick with the game now. a4 was played, preparing to activate this rook. And now this is where Hans plays the final crushing thunderbolt of the game. If you want to pause and look for this move, please do so. So in this position, Hans plays the devastating rook takes on h2. Now the king cannot capture this one. It wasn't taken. This didn't happen because then the queen activates to g4 and it's just hopeless. This knight is attacked and then the pawn behind it. So say you go queen e5 to hold the knight. Well, now there are different winning moves, but this is the most beautiful. Pawn to f2. Hits the rook and also takes away the g1 square from the king. So you're now threatening queen h4 checkmate. So to stop these threats, the best move here is rook to e4. You stop the queen from coming to h4, but then you can actually make a queen. This is just so nice, because if the rook takes, you mate like this. If the knight takes, then you mate like this using the rook. So the whole thing is just completely over. Yeah, I've covered the lines there. So you can't do anything here from this position after the pawn queens. So coming back here, the king cannot take on h2. It's completely immune. So instead, rook a3 was played, activating, trying to swing in. And now every move wins for black, basically. You could take here with check first. You could do what Niemann does, which is pick up the knight, delay the check. We had a check here, king a7, and here Christopher Yoo resigned. Not premature, it's completely over. Just to show you how the line could have gone, say you take on h2, well now we have this same kind of checkmate coming in like this. Even if you don't take on h2, you're just collapsing in a moment. So stunning game from Hans Niemann. If you want to see another one of these exceptional games which are being analysed right now, then check out this video on screen here. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.